In my lover's arms, I listened as he lovingly described his mother. He had no idea that I, his company's top lawyer, was orchestrating the deal that would leave her jobless and homeless. I was the architect of his family's ruin, and he thought I was his escape. Saturday morning spilled honeyed light across our Soho loft, filtering through the immense floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood at the kitchen island in my silk robe, watching the foam swirl slowly in my latte, a perfect, fleeting spiral. The air was a carefully composed symphony of scents: rich coffee, the subtle warmth of toasted almonds from the granola I'd ignored, and the clean, expensive fragrance of Mark's cologne. It was the scent of our life, of a morning meticulously designed for peace. Everything was precisely where it should be, a testament to a life lived without sharp edges. He came up behind me then, his arms circling my waist in a familiar, possessive embrace. Mark rested his chin on my shoulder, his freshly shaven cheek smooth against my skin. We stood there in silence for a moment, two figures in a portrait, looking out at the waking city below. The iconic yellow taxis were like miniature toys navigating a complex grid, and the few pedestrians moved with the lazy, unhurried grace that only a weekend can bestow. This was our kingdom, viewed from a safe, comfortable distance. Everything felt stable, predictable, and immutably ours. I was thinking about the Maldives. Mark's voice was a low, even murmur against my ear, the soundtrack to our perfect existence. Or maybe the Amalfi Coast again. We could book that villa we saw last year. He spoke of our future as if it were a brochure of curated experiences, each one more luxurious than the last. His words were meant to be a comfort, a reaffirmation of the seamless path we were on. I nodded along, playing my part, a small smile affixed to my lips as I listened to the details of a life I was supposed to desperately want. This life had no room for error, no space for the messy, unpredictable currents of real chaos. It was a structure we had built with a shared ambition, its foundations reinforced by his certainty and my compliance. I sipped my coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest, a temporary antidote to a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I was an actress who had played the same role for so long that the lines had become my own, the costume a second skin. It was safe here, in this beautiful, sterile cage. And then, a vibration. It was sharp and jarring against the polished marble of the countertop where my phone lay screen up. The sound cut through the quiet hum of our morning, a dissonant note in our carefully composed harmony. A single name illuminated the screen, a name that did not belong in this perfect picture, in this perfect life with my perfect husband. It was a name from a different world, a world I kept locked away. Beneath it was one word. A simple, devastating command that felt like a gunshot in the silent room: now. The workday at Sterling, Price and Partners was a world away from the soft, honeyed light of my Soho loft. Here, on the 45th floor of a midtown skyscraper, the universe was composed of steel, glass, and the hushed, purposeful murmur of immense wealth being maneuvered. It was less an office and more a perfectly calibrated machine, each component performing its function with frictionless precision. In this world, I was not a component, I was one of the engineers, a senior associate in mergers and acquisitions, and my entire existence was dedicated to ensuring the machine ran not just smoothly, but ruthlessly. My current focus, the engine I was tasked with building and unleashing, was codenamed the Ordeal. It was a hostile takeover, intricate and brutal, demanding a level of concentration that bordered on obsession. It consumed my days and haunted the edges of my nights, a complex puzzle of leverage and liability. And on my team, assigned to help me navigate its treacherous corridors, was David. On paper, he was several rungs below me on the corporate ladder, a junior associate with a less prestigious law school on his resume. But paper lied. In any room, David possessed a quiet gravity that seniority couldn't grant and money couldn't buy. It was in his composure, a stillness that suggested he had weathered storms far more violent than a boardroom negotiation. His mind was sharp, but it was also unburdened by the rigid, institutional thinking that afflicted so many of our colleagues. He saw angles others missed, not because he was smarter, but because he looked at the world from a foundation of life experience that this glass tower was designed to ignore. He was an anomaly in this sterile environment. Our public interactions were a model of professional decorum, a carefully choreographed dance of exchanged files, concise briefings in the hallway, and polite, almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgement. We were colleagues, nothing more. But in the sterile air between our desks, in the charged silence of a shared elevator ride, a different kind of tension was building. It was an unspoken current that flowed beneath the surface of our polite formalities, a low hum of awareness that was both unnerving and deeply compelling. It manifested in the smallest of moments, the kind that would be invisible to anyone else. It was there when our eyes would meet for a fraction of a second too long across the polished expanse of the conference table, a silent acknowledgement of a shared thought before we both looked away. It was there when he'd hand me a document, his fingers brushing against mine, a brief, electric contact that sent a jolt through my system and forced me to steady my breath. Each instance was a tiny tear in the fabric of my carefully controlled world. This silent awareness began to bleed into the rest of my day, a subtle poison. I found myself listening for the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hall, my focus momentarily breaking when he walked past my glass-walled office. I'd feel his presence before I saw him, a strange magnetic pull that drew my attention from the complex legal frameworks on my screen. He was becoming a distraction, a variable I hadn't accounted for, and the engineer in me knew that unaccounted for variables were the most dangerous threat to any complex machine. One Tuesday evening, the threat escalated. The office had long since emptied, the frantic energy of the day bleeding out into the city below, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. Outside the vast windows, Manhattan had transformed into a glittering tapestry of a million lights, a silent, beautiful witness. We were the only two left on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of the workday, trying to hammer out the final, most vicious clauses of the Aura contract. The air was thick with shared exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline of the deal. The stress of the past few weeks had worn down my defenses, leaving my nerves raw and exposed. We worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft click of my keyboard and the rustle of paper as he reviewed the latest draft. There was an intimacy in the quiet, a sense of being two survivors on a deserted island of polished concrete and steel. The professional boundary that had felt so solid during the day now seemed porous, almost non-existent in the dim light of the empty office. He stood up from the small table where he'd been working and walked over to my desk. I didn't look up, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing screen, but I tracked his approach in my peripheral vision, every nerve in my body suddenly on high alert. He stopped beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a stark contrast to the chilled, recycled air of the office. He leaned in, ostensibly to point at a specific line item on my monitor, a justification for his proximity. Then, his hand came to rest on the high back of my leather chair, just inches from my shoulder. It was a casual, almost unconscious gesture, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. I froze completely, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could feel the heat of his palm through the thin fabric of my blouse, a searing point of contact that grounded me in the terrifying reality of the moment. My breath caught in my throat, and the entire world seemed to narrow to that single, silent point of connection. I didn't turn. I didn't speak. I just stared at the meaningless, glowing words on the screen, my mind a deafening roar of panic and something else, something I refused to name. The silence in the vast, empty office stretched into an eternity, filled with everything we hadn't said for weeks. It was a silence that asked a question, a dangerous, life-altering question. His hand didn't move away. It remained there, a steady, patient wait, a silent offer. And I didn't pull away. In that stillness, in that refusal to retreat to the safety of my role, I gave him my answer. My own silence was a form of consent, a surrender to the gravitational pull I had been fighting for so long. The moment was more intimate than any kiss, more binding than any whispered promise. It was a point of no return, reached without a single word being spoken. It was the moment the machine I had so carefully engineered finally, irrevocably, broke. Our affair lived in the anonymous spaces of the city, thriving in the shadows cast by my real life. We met in faceless, transient hotel rooms in Chelsea, places with generic art on the walls and the faint, antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning products. These rooms were non-places, neutral territories where we were not a senior and junior associate, not a husband and a wife, but simply two bodies drawn together by a force we had stopped trying to rationalize. Here, the rules of the 45th floor, and of my Soho loft, did not apply. More often, we met at his apartment in Harlem. It was a world so fundamentally different from my own that crossing its threshold felt like stepping into another country. Where my loft was a curated expanse of minimalist design and cool, muted tones, his space was a warm, cluttered testament to a life fully lived. Books were not just for decoration, they were piled in precarious stacks on the floor and overflowing from shelves. An old vinyl player, not a sleek wireless sound system, was his source of music, and the air smelled of old paper, sandalwood, and whatever spices he'd last used in the kitchen. It was in these spaces, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his life, that the heavy armor I wore every day would begin to fall away. The sharp-edged, impeccably dressed corporate lawyer would recede, leaving behind someone I barely recognized anymore. Here, I was not orchestrating multi-billion-dollar takeovers or managing the expectations of a husband who saw me as a partner in his own ambition. I was just a woman, unburdened by title or expectation, allowed to simply exist in the quiet warmth of his presence, and that feeling was more intoxicating than any victory in the boardroom. One afternoon, stolen from the relentless march of billable hours, we were lying in his bed. The autumn light, softer and more forgiving than the harsh morning sun, filtered through his large, old window, painting stripes across the wooden floor and the rumpled sheets. The faint sounds of the street below, a distant siren, the murmur of conversation, the bass from a passing car, were a gentle reminder of the vibrant, living world outside, a world that felt a million miles away from the silent, pressurized cabins of Midtown. We had made love not with the frantic energy of our first encounters, but with a slow, languid tenderness that spoke of a deepening intimacy. Afterward, we lay tangled together, the silence comfortable, our conversation drifting aimlessly. We didn't talk about work, about the ordeal that consumed our days, or about the futures we were supposed to be building in our separate lives. We talked about small, simple things. He told me about growing up in this neighborhood, about the first record he ever bought, about a trip he took to New Orleans that changed the way he heard music. I listened, absorbing the details of his history, feeling like an archivist discovering a lost and beautiful text. He started talking about his mother. The subject arose naturally, flowing from a memory of his childhood. As he spoke, his voice softened, imbued with a warmth and a profound affection that I had never heard from anyone, least of all from Mark when he spoke of his own family. David described her not as a matriarch or a distant figure, but as a person, full of quiet strength, humor, and an unwavering belief in doing good in a small, tangible way. He painted a picture of a woman who was the anchor of his world, the source of his steady, unassuming confidence. She had worked for the same company her entire life, he explained. A small, unglamorous pharmaceutical firm that wasn't in the business of creating blockbuster drugs, but of manufacturing affordable vitamins and nutritional supplements, mostly for the elderly. He spoke of her pride in her work, in knowing that the product she helped create was going to people in nursing homes and community centers, people often forgotten by the larger, more profitable segments of the healthcare industry. It was, for her, more than a job, it was a vocation. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that made my chest ache. He described the community she had there, the colleagues who had become a second family over decades of shared lunches and company picnics. He talked about how the work gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get up every morning, a feeling of being a vital part of something that mattered. His words were so full of love and admiration, so pure in their intent, that I felt a pang of something ugly and unfamiliar, envy for a life built on connection rather than conquest. I was lulled by the rhythm of his voice, by the warmth of his body next to mine, feeling a sense of peace that was utterly alien to me. I was safe here, in this cocoon of stolen time, wrapped in his arms and his stories. It was in this state of serene detachment that he said the name. He said it casually, with a gentle fondness, the same way one might mention the name of a beloved family home. He spoke of his mother's pride in working for a company with such a positive, life-affirming name. He said, "Or health." The word struck me with the force of a physical impact. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. Every muscle in my body went rigid, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I didn't pull away, but in his arms, I became a statue, a cold, unfeeling thing. The soft, forgiving light of the afternoon suddenly felt harsh and interrogatory. Or a health. Not a similar name. The exact name. The name on every document that had covered my desk for the past 3 months. The name of the company I was systematically, and legally, preparing to disembowel. My mind, the cold, efficient engine of my professional success, began to race, pulling up the files I knew by heart. Aura Health, target of acquisition. Strategy, hostile takeover. Post-acquisition plan, full operational restructuring. And the key metric, the one my boss had called the beautiful, unsentimental core of the deal, flashed in my mind in blazing, damning clarity. A projected staff reduction of 80% to maximize shareholder value. 80%. In that single, horrifying moment, lying in the arms of my lover, the abstract nature of my work was annihilated. The numbers on the spreadsheets, the clauses in the contracts, the strategic projections I had so skillfully crafted, they all coalesced into a single, brutal reality. It wasn't a headcount reduction or a workforce optimization. It was his mother. The woman he spoke of with such reverence. The woman whose sense of purpose I was about to extinguish with a stroke of my pen. I was the architect of her destruction. And he had no idea. The knowledge of David's mother was a poison that seeped into every corner of my life. Work, once a sanctuary of cold, clean logic, became a landscape of personal torment. The ordeal was no longer a complex puzzle to be solved but a guillotine I was personally sharpening. Every document I reviewed, every email I sent, felt like another step towards a betrayal so profound I couldn't fully comprehend its shape. The pressure, which had once been a motivating force, now felt like a physical weight trying to crush me from all sides, and I was suffocating in the silence of my own deceit. The vice tightened with each passing day. My boss, a man who measured success in destroyed competitors and inflated share prices, began to summon me for daily progress reports. He would stand before the vast window of his corner office, a silhouette against the city, and speak of the ordeal with a predatory gleam in his eyes. He called it a brilliant operation, praising my surgical precision and lack of sentimentality. Each word of praise landed like a lash, a reward for a crime he didn't know I was committing. I would nod, my face a mask of professional composure, while inside I was screaming. The pressure at home was of a different, more insidious kind. Mark, blissfully unaware of the human wreckage at the core of my latest project, saw only the victory. He knew the deal was massive, a career-defining moment, and his excitement was a constant, cheerful torture. Over dinner at a restaurant where the wine list cost more than a monthly salary, he would plan our future. He spoke of the bonus I would receive, mapping out how it would accelerate our path to a larger apartment, a summer home in the Hamptons, a life even more insulated and perfect than the one we already had. "This is going to change our lives, Sarah," he said one evening, his eyes bright with a mixture of pride and impatient ambition. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch meant to be reassuring, but it felt like the closing of a manacle. I looked at our joined hands against the starched white linen and saw the terrible, beautiful prison we had built for ourselves. He saw a triumph that would elevate us. I saw a sin that would drag me down into a place from which there was no escape, and he would never, ever understand. Fueled by a desperation that felt like madness, I tried to push back. I scheduled a meeting with my boss, armed with arguments I knew were futile. I didn't plead for mercy, I framed my suggestions in the language he understood. I spoke of potential litigation from disgruntled employees, of the negative press that could follow a mass layoff. I proposed enhanced severance packages, a more gradual restructuring, anything to soften the blow. I was arguing for the life of David's mother without ever speaking her name, a ghost in the boardroom. He listened with a kind of detached amusement, his fingers steepled before him. When I finished, he didn't even pause to consider my points. Sarah, he said, his voice flat and final, our job is to maximize value for our client. This is business, not a charitable foundation. Your sentimentality is noted, but it is not required. He dismissed me with a slight wave of his hand, and I walked out of his office understanding the true nature of my position. I was not an engineer of this machine, I was just another one of its expensive, replaceable parts. The wall was absolute. The final signing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. The day had a funereal quality, the hours ticking down to a foregone conclusion. When the summons came, I walked to the main conference room, the one reserved for closing major deals, and my footsteps echoed on the marble floor like a death knell. The room was already filled with the firm's senior partners and the client's representatives. The atmosphere was jubilant, the air thick with the scent of impending victory and expensive cologne. Men were smiling, shaking hands, their voices a low, triumphant hum. They placed the final version of the agreement in the center of the vast mahogany table. It was a thick, heavy document, bound in dark blue, its sheer physical weight a metaphor for the lives it was about to crush. They slid towards my seat, the pages whispering against the polished wood. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the ridiculously expensive fountain pen they provided for such occasions. It felt impossibly heavy in my fingers, a weapon I was being forced to turn on myself. As I looked down at the signature line, the black ink of the legal text blurred before my eyes. All I could see was David's face in his Harlem apartment, his expression soft with love as he spoke about his mother. I could hear his voice, not the professional cadence of the office, but the warm, intimate murmur from his bed. That world, the only place I had felt truly alive, was about to be annihilated by this one, the world of sterile power and calculated cruelty. My career, my marriage, my entire, carefully constructed life on one side, the soul of the man I loved on the other. I took a sharp, silent breath, the air burning in my lungs. I thought of Mark's excited smile, of my boss's dismissive wave, of the relentless forward momentum of the life I had chosen. There was no other path. There was no escape. I lowered the pen to the paper, the nib scratching against the fiber, and with a steady, practiced hand that did not feel like my own, I signed my name. The ink was dark and permanent. A quiet cheer went through the room. I had just become a spectacular success. I had just destroyed everything that mattered. That evening, I didn't go home. I couldn't face Mark's triumphant celebration, couldn't bear to drink the champagne I knew would be waiting. Instead, I found myself in a taxi, the city lights smearing past the window like wet paint, heading uptown. I was running not away from my guilt, but directly towards its source. It was a self-destructive, irrational impulse, a desperate need to stand in the warmth of the fire I had just set. I had to see him. I needed to seek comfort from the very person I had just condemned. When he opened the door to his apartment, his smile was a physical blow. He saw the strain on my face and mistook it for the exhaustion of closing a major deal. He pulled me inside, his arms wrapping around me in an embrace that felt both like a sanctuary and a desecration. He led me to the bedroom, his touch gentle, his voice a low murmur of concern. He thought he was comforting the victor, the brilliant lawyer who had just won her great battle. He had no idea he was holding the executioner. Our bodies came together not with the tenderness of our stolen afternoons, but with a raw, desperate ferocity that was almost violent. It was not about pleasure or intimacy, it was about oblivion. I clung to him, my nails digging into his back, trying to anchor myself to the one real thing in my life, even as I was poisoning it with my silence. This was my penance, my confession, and my punishment, all acted out in a silent, furious language of the flesh. I was a drowning woman pulling her savior down with her, fully aware that I was the one who had just ripped a hole in the bottom of our fragile, impossible boat. The drive to my mother's apartment in Queens was a journey back in time, a retreat from the sharp, ambitious angles of Manhattan. Her building was old but immaculately kept, a pocket of quiet dignity in a city that had mostly forgotten it. I came to help her pack, a task that sounded simple but was, in reality, the careful and heartbreaking work of dismantling a life. Her small apartment, a place that had always felt cozy and full, was now a chaotic maze of cardboard boxes, each one a tombstone for a piece of her past. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of the tea she was constantly brewing. She was trying to be stoic, moving with a forced, deliberate calm that didn't quite conceal the tremor in her hands. She would pick up a small, framed photograph, stare at it for a long moment, and then carefully wrap it in newspaper before placing it in a box labeled memories. Her strength was a quiet, stubborn thing, but I could see the confusion and fear lingering in the corners of her eyes. She had given this company 40 years of her life, a loyalty that now felt naive and foolish. They had repaid it with a form letter and a deadline to vacate the home she'd known for 2 decades. On the small kitchen table, amidst stacks of old books and porcelain knickknacks she couldn't decide whether to keep or discard, was the official envelope. It lay there like an unexploded bomb, a crisp, white rectangle of corporate indifference. Inside were the documents that had officially ended her career and her tenancy. The legal instruments that had rendered 4 decades of her labor obsolete. She hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it away, as if its physical presence was the only proof that this nightmare was actually happening. I picked up the papers, my professional instincts taking over. My role here was to be the capable son, the lawyer who could translate this cold, inhuman language into something she could understand. As I began to read, a familiar, detached anger started to build in me. It was the same anger I felt for so many of our clients, a righteous fury directed at the faceless, soulless corporate machine that chewed up people like my mother and spat them out without a second thought. It was an impersonal rage, the kind that fuels lawsuits and righteous indignation. It was, I thought, a safe kind of anger. The language was standard, full of the sterile jargon designed to strip the humanity out of the process. Workforce redundancy, operational synergies, restructuring. Each phrase was a euphemism for a human catastrophe. I scanned the termination clauses, the paltry severance calculations, the cold, non-negotiable timeline for her eviction from company housing. It was brutal, but it was all perfectly, impeccably legal. The architects of this destruction had covered their tracks with the precision and skill that only a top-tier law firm could provide. I moved through the pages methodically, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of text. I was looking for loopholes, for any small error in procedure that could give us leverage, but I found none. The work was flawless. It was a perfectly constructed cage with no bars to rattle. My anger began to give way to a grim sense of resignation. There was nothing to be done. The machine was too big, too powerful. All that was left was to help my mother pack her boxes and find a new place to live, a new life to build from the wreckage of the old one. Then, I reached the final section of the document, the appendices. It was mostly boilerplate, lists of assets and legal notices. But one page caught my eye. It was a list of the key representatives from both parties, the primary legal counsel responsible for executing the transaction. It was a list of names, of the people who had built this cage. I scanned the names for the acquiring firm, the faceless enemy. And that is when I saw it. Printed in the same cold, impersonal font as the rest of the document, was a name that did not belong here, in this world of my mother's quiet pain. It was the last name first, Henderson. For a moment, it meant nothing. A common name. But then my eyes moved to the first name, and the air was stolen from my lungs. The world didn't crash or explode. It simply stopped. The quiet sounds of the apartment, my mother moving in the next room, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, faded into a deafening silence. There, on the line designated for the lead counsel of the acquiring firm, was her full legal name. The name I had never known, had never even thought to ask. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson. My mind fractured. 2 images, 2 realities, slammed into each other with impossible force. There was Sarah in my bed, her head on my chest, her laughter echoing in the quiet of my Harlem apartment, her body warm and real and alive next to mine. And then there was this name, this cold collection of letters on a page, the signature on the document that had just destroyed my mother's world. The two were irreconcilable, a paradox that my brain could not compute. And yet, there it was. Inarguable. Immutable. I stared at the name, the ink a black stain on the pristine white paper. Henderson. Her married name. The name she never used, the name that belonged to the other life, the husband in the Soho loft. She had compartmentalized her life so perfectly, and I had been a willing participant in the deception. I had accepted the carefully edited version of her she presented to me, never questioning the parts she left out. I had believed our world, the world of stolen afternoons and quiet intimacy, was separate, that it was real. The betrayal, when it finally crystallized in the frozen landscape of my mind, was so absolute, so complete, that it was almost sublime. It was not about her husband. I had always known about him, he was a known variable, a part of the flawed equation that had brought us together. The real betrayal was this. It was the knowledge that while she was lying in my arms, she was simultaneously orchestrating the ruin of my family. The intimacy we shared was not a refuge from her world, it was a lie that concealed its most brutal operations. Her hand, the same one that had traced the lines of my face, had signed this order. She had personally, professionally, and with surgical precision, legalized my own private catastrophe. Several months passed, a sterile and silent stretch of time. The fallout from the Oral Health acquisition settled like a fine, toxic dust over the city, its most significant consequence being a widely publicized class action lawsuit filed by the terminated employees. As the architect of the deal, I was, of course, promoted. I was now a senior partner, my name newly stenciled in gold on a heavier, more important door. I had a corner office with a view that stretched all the way to the hazy outline of the Atlantic. From the outside, my ascent was meteoric, a perfect trajectory of corporate success. Mark was ecstatic. We were living the life he had always planned. Inside, however, there was only a scorched and silent desert. The victory was a phantom, the promotion a gilded cage. I moved through my days with the flawless precision of an automaton, my face a carefully maintained mask of competence and authority. I led meetings, drafted strategies, and accepted the congratulations of my peers, all while a part of me remained frozen in the memory of David's apartment. He had simply vanished. No angry call, no confrontation, no dramatic resignation. One day he was there, a silent and potent presence in my life, and the next, he was gone. His email account was deactivated, his desk cleared. He had disappeared without a trace. His absence was a constant, screaming void. The silence was more damning than any accusation he could have leveled. It allowed my guilt to fester, to imagine the worst possible scenarios. Did he know? How could he know? Or did he simply leave, sensing the rot at the core of what we were doing? I spent my nights staring at the ceiling of my perfect Soho loft, the silence of my sleeping husband beside me a mirror of the silence David had left behind. I was haunted not by his ghost, but by the terrifying uncertainty of his knowledge. When the lawsuit landed, I was assigned to lead the defense. It was a cruel, perfect irony. My reward for orchestrating the destruction was the responsibility of justifying it in a court of law. I threw myself into the work with a kind of manic desperation, using the familiar armor of legal strategy to shield myself from the human cost I had authored. I depersonalized the plaintiffs, turning them from a collection of ruined lives into a set of legal arguments to be dismantled. They were a problem to be solved, a threat to our client to be neutralized. It was the only way I could survive. The day of the first preliminary hearing arrived. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that should have felt full of promise. I walked into the cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom of the Southern District of New York with my team flanking me. I was the picture of confidence, my suit perfectly tailored, my expression impassive. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before a battle, the cold, clean focus of the fight. This was my territory. I understood the rules here. I sat at our designated table, the polished wood cool beneath my hands, and arranged my files, preparing for the faceless adversary on the other side. The door across the vast room opened, and my breath caught in my throat. I watched, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, as the plaintiff's legal team filed in. They were a small, scrappy-looking group from a public interest firm, the kind of lawyers we typically crushed under the sheer weight of our resources. They looked earnest and outmatched. And then, he walked in behind them. He was not trailing them, he was leading them. He was their center of gravity. It was David. But it was not the David I knew. The man who entered that courtroom was a stranger, an impeccably crafted effigy of the person I had held in my arms. He wore a dark, perfectly fitted suit that made him look taller, broader, more formidable. The easy, thoughtful demeanor I knew was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. His eyes, when they swept the room, were not the warm, expressive eyes I remembered, they were the hard, calculating eyes of a warrior who had come to burn a city to the ground. He had not come for personal revenge. He had not come to expose our affair. He had chosen a far more elegant, and far more devastating, path. He had accepted the role of lead counsel for the plaintiffs. He was not going to destroy my personal life, he was going to attack the very foundation of my professional one. He had positioned himself as my direct, legal, and public opponent. We were now the heads of two opposing armies, destined to meet on this consecrated ground. He had taken all the pain, all the betrayal, all the knowledge I had hidden from him, and he had forged it into a weapon. A weapon he was now aiming directly at my head. Our eyes met across the gulf of the courtroom. The space between our tables felt like a mile-wide chasm. The brief, electric moment held no trace of the intimacy we once shared. There was no love. There was no hatred. There was only the chilling, absolute clarity of a new reality. In his gaze, I saw the reflection of my own choices, the final, terrible accounting of my actions. We were enemies. Everything that had existed between us, the stolen afternoons, the whispered conversations, the desperate intimacy, was now inadmissible evidence in a trial where we would be forced to publicly and methodically disembowel each other's arguments. The judge entered, a black-robed figure of ultimate authority, and the room rose as one. He sat, and the gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed in the vaulted silence. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice booming. For everyone else in that magnificent, imposing room, a high-stakes corporate lawsuit was beginning. A battle of motions and precedents, of shareholder value versus human dignity. For David and me, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of our own private, exquisitely tailored hell.